Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
Paddy in the studio.
And Henry at home.
With a terrifying plant.
Remind us, it's an othos or something, or a pothos or a pathos.
It was about a year ago. Sorry, this is the sort of recurrent plot line from some years ago now.
It's a recurrent plant line.
It's a pothos, isn't it?
I don't know. It's getting quite big, though.
Well, yeah, I've been tending it well, despite both of you claiming that it looks terrible.
I think it needs to be pruned so that it's less long and more plant-like. Anyway,
it's a trailing plant.
It's a trailing plant.
That's the point.
Prune your pothos.
It's a classic COVID thing. People got plants that sort of work in Zoom backgrounds. And I thought one of them until I appeared on Newscast and you two decided that it's horrible.
But it's like taking over your poster. We're not saying it's horrible. It's just got really big. It's going to take over you next time round. Next weekend, you'll be like, sort of David Bellamy coming through the pothos, if indeed it is a pothos. Newscasters, I'm sure that you will correct us when we're wrong, as we often are.
So we will eventually get around to talking about the news. I should say we're sitting in a room with plastic plants.
Yes.
I take it back. Henry's got better plants. So there's been a whole world of 100-dayism and a row over shipping. And you had the business secretary on.
We did. We had the business secretary, a billionaire, and the country's biggest banker. And how many times can I say B? Because there's a big business summit happening tomorrow. Yes, but the Transport Secretary, Lou managed to really offend one of the companies that's coming to the government's long-planned investment summit. And the government was hoping very much they're going to put a shaky hand onto a cheque for £1 billion of investment. But this argument came about when Lou, the Transport Secretary, said that P&O Ferries, owned by DP World, was a rogue operator and she'd been boycotting them. It's a pretty embarrassing thing for the business secretary to have to come out and defend this morning. This is what he said.
We have always said, and we believe, that what happened with P&O Ferries was wrong. I believe even the Conservative government at the time was clear that they believed it was wrong. The problem was it was lawful then. It's not going to be lawful now. And so we have changed the law. We've got part of our Employment Rights Bill is what does this. And
therefore, when they got rid of some staff and then rehired them.
Fire and rehire, and it was a particularly egregious case. So we were clear about that. I'm not going to recall from that position. But where companies accept that we're not allowing that to happen anymore, and we can work with them on investments into the country, we can have a conversation with them, we will do. So it's not the government's position to boycott them.
Now, the problem here is that one cabinet minister said, I've been boycotting P&O and everybody should do that. Then 2 days later, the business secretary says, no, we don't say that you should boycott a company that is a big company and we've changed the law around employment practices. And look, that is just downright embarrassing. Lou, the transport secretary, has obviously had a metaphorical telling off. And Jonathan Reynolds went on to say, well, I speak for the government on business. And it's just all a bit messy, really. So they've got to the position in the end. DP World is coming to the summit. Jonathan Reynolds told us that they are going to spend £1 billion.
Amazing.
So, move on.
Yeah,
but it's awkward for the government because they've told us again and again and again and again, after all the confusion of the Tory years, we're going to be clear, we're going to be calm, we're not going to fight with each other, we're not going to make each other look silly. And this has made them all look a bit silly.
But faced with two outcomes, one where DP World did not go to this week's investment summit and did not give £1 billion, or versus the other one when it looked like they weren't going at all, Henry.
And there's two extra components to this story as well, just to add in. One is that the Prime Minister also did what Johnny Reynolds did this morning. In fact, he did it on Newscast yesterday when he essentially said that Louise Haigh hadn't been speaking for the government, or didn't put it quite that way. But then you can also see why Louise Haigh would be annoyed, to say the least, with this development, because the language that she had used was very similar to language that went out from the government in a press release, which will have been signed off by all the people in Keir Starmer's current iteration of number 10. And I think all of this does speak to a tension for a political party that is simultaneously trying to cast itself as the party of business, been doing so for years in opposition, and this investment summit is designed very early on in their tenure in government to demonstrate that, but also the political party which exists to defend the interests of workers. And I don't think, in private at least, you would find a single Labour MP who would say anything other than that P&O Ferries treated workers extremely shabbily and ought to face consequences for that.
But then, of course, the law is changing. So the loophole by which the P&O bosses did not inform the government because they didn't have to because of the flagging rules, that's being changed. So a company that wanted to do this at sea again could not do that. So they've squared the circle in a way. And if they've got the £1 billion investments conference, this is going to look like small fry, isn't it?
That's certainly what they hope, right? That is absolutely certainly what they hope, and that people will move on and there won't be any more kind of slip-ups. But I think it talks to that balance of trying to be on the side of both workers and business. That is a difficult thing to do. That's a difficult, you've got two things that you're trying to juggle, and that's hard. There's another kind of point to this that I would just suggest, and some people said, oh, well, Liu He, she'll be in trouble, and when there's a reshuffle, she'll be for the chop. Well, if you're being really kind of nerdy about it and looking into the soul of what's going on in the Labour Party, I think part of this is also an example of what quite a few people describe is there's a sort of inner ring of kind of precious government ministers who are all in the sort of inner beating heart of the Starmer operation.
Right.
And then there's a sort of outer ring of people who are very much not. And I think what you've seen here is an example of that. You've got somebody who might be in that sort of outer ring, and that's not at all to be rude about Louise Haigh. I just think it is something that people in the Labour Party reflect, especially at this 100 days mark. I've been talking to lots of people across the Labour Party, and there's basically a sort of inner gang and an outer gang. And I think that's part of what's going on here. And one Labour source actually was messaging me yesterday saying, oh, well, we just have to get on with moving her on. And also, obviously, she's somebody who'll be for the chop. I'm not saying that's someone who's speaking with authority, but it just plays into that sense that there's not a them and us, but even 100 days in, there's certainly the sort of special ones in the middle and then everybody else on the outside.
And one thing to add to that, I completely agree, is that those cabinet ministers in the outer ring were generally empowered by Sue Gray.
Yes.
When she came in as chief of staff, she, in opposition a year or so ago, she kept saying, hang on, why are there no elected politicians in this meeting? And she would get members of the then shadow cabinet in, people like Louise Haigh, who weren't necessarily in the sort of strategic core of Starmer's operation, and empower them. And actually, I think as it happens, Louise Haigh personally was probably closer to Sue Gray than almost any other cabinet minister. Clearly, Sue Gray is no longer Keir Starmer's chief of staff, and you can see perhaps things starting to revert to that previous way of doing things.
I mean, you can see the frustration for the Labour government because she also, as Transport Secretary, has pretty much confirmed that the HS2 London link will be Euston Station rather than miles outside, which the Conservatives were going to do. And, I don't want to talk too much about London because newscasters live all over the UK, but that is a massive announcement. The £1 billion is a massive announcement. With more, there'll be more announcements, you can be sure of that. So there is an awful lot of noise, said Mike Tapp to me, the MP for Dover and Deal. And actually, we are going to try and crack on.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because this 100-day marker point, which is a completely artificial. However, why not have a yardstick? It's a kind of moment to say how they've been getting on. It has not gone as they had hoped, no doubt about that. They've done lots of things they're happy about, but lots of things have gone wrong. There is a massive question mark over whether or not the Starmer 2.0, which we are already at Starmer 2.0, only in October, having one in July. Is it going to be a better operation than Starmer 1.0? Now, Sue Gray is out and Morgan McSweeney is in. We don't know the answer to that question. And there are some people in government who've been saying things to me like, well, Sue Gray actually was covering up the fact that other people were failing because she became the target for everything. And actually, someone in the cabinet actually said to me that, now the people who were failing have got nowhere to hide. Interesting. So we will see. And, this thing about P&O isn't it's clearly the government thinks they've fixed it. Is it a massive disaster? No, it's not. But it's another interesting little episode. And John Caldwell, who likes to call himself a philanthropist, but is also a billionaire, he of Phones for You, he's backing Labour. He backed them just before the election. But he did say this morning they've got to be really careful about the steps they take. And also, he said using that kind of language around businesses is basically completely bonkers. I paraphrase. So it says Labour has to be careful about this. They have to really cherish people who can create wealth, who can create jobs. And it ain't always easy to do that because politics doesn't always see business as an unalloyed force for good.
So, Henry, I'm going to come to you with a swerve. Yeah, and of course, the thing is about the 100 days and how they're dealing with business. I remember another number of days, 49, and how Liz Truss dealt with business, which was to take the country to the cleaners, basically. And of course, she would, if she was here, and let's come up, by all means, let's have her, she'd say she was wronged by the blob. But Henry, it's still the case for voters who might think it has been a bit rocky, that this 100 days, which is twice Liz Truss's premiership, is already much better than that.
Totally. And I think there's two contradictory thoughts that I'm holding in my head at the same time while thinking about the 100 days as a yardstick. One is that for all that we've just said about things that have gone wrong and so on, it's 100 days. The next general election is not going to be until 2028 at the very earliest. I'd say more likely 2029. Think back to how much has happened in the last 4 years and 5 years. Who knows on what yardstick the Labour Prime Minister, presumably Keir Starmer, but potentially not, will be judged come the end of that Parliament. On the other hand, and it is odd to talk about polling 100 days into a new government, 100 days into a new parliamentary term. But on the other hand, it does seem, from what polling there is, that the public really have noticed some of this new government's difficulties. Keir Starmer's popularity hasn't dipped a little since July. It has collapsed. I know that there are people at the top of government who are worried about that. I was speaking to someone yesterday, in fact, who said to me that the thing that they're really worried about is that they're now being told by MPs that Keir Starmer's suits and the row over that is coming up way more on the doorstep than the winter fuel allowance ever did. And this idea that it's just become attached to him as a person and symbolises what people think of him as a person. Now, a lot of people will think that's deeply unfair. Nevertheless, I'm just passing on what someone at the top of the Labour Party who thinks that's deeply unfair was telling me. So I do think, if this new government wasn't worried by how things have developed in 100 days, even though, of course, they're going to be there for another 3, 4, 5 years to come, then they wouldn't have made the drastic changes that they have already made to how the government is operating. Right. I think that's the biggest symbol of their own concern.
Yeah, you mean the change of the Chief of Staff?
Yeah, that's a big deal to do that.
Of course it is.
It's a huge deal to do that. And I think while we can say that 100 days, well, it's all a bit silly.
Well, it is silly.
It is silly, except that in politics, perception is not all, but perception is incredibly important. And you do not get a second chance to make a first impression. And particularly on things that might seem a bit grubby or a bit sleazy that the public can seize on very, very quickly. It took more than 2 weeks for the government to come up with a sort of a rule change or a new position on donations and all of those things. 2 weeks when they let a story run that absolutely has got into the public conscience. Right. And do you remember the first day that story came up? We sat here, we had David Lammy on our programme in the morning, and our inbox was absolutely on that first day stuffed with angry emails from people saying, what is this all about? And that's the kind of thing, it's very difficult to rub out that impression once you've made it, and it does matter.
The timing thing, on all the days that there are, Alistair Campbell was on the Today programme. He, one of the architects of the 97 victory and the presentation of the Blair project. And he said, actually, what Labour has done this time is allow a lot of time between election and the first budget. And actually, maybe the part of the timing question that is real, and I'm saying 100 days, 100 days, is that we're waiting for Rachel. We used to be waiting for Sue Gray. Now we're waiting for Rachel.
But you see, somebody in government was quite narked that people have been slagging them off about that, because to do a budget properly, you have to allow the Office for Budget Responsibility to do the proper process. And essentially, they couldn't really have done it any quicker unless they'd done an emergency budget, which is a made up thing anyway, or unless they'd done a budget without going through the proper process. So, so there, said somebody on the inside of government who referred to that same comment that had been made and said, actually, the process is different in the 2020s than it was in the late 90s. However, it has created this sort of vacuum. It's created this sort of pause. And I don't think, I know also in number 10, they're worried at how people are going to take the budget because it's going to have some nasties in it. And that is it's not necessarily going to be the solution. It might make things even worse. And there's so much pressure on the budget being the moment when they could either really move on and start motoring, or maybe create even more jeopardy and even more unhappiness.
Well, and bear in mind that one of the tonal shifts that has taken place in the past few weeks in the government is to move. I think they overdid the doom and gloom at the start, and they think that they need to present more of a sense of where things are going and the sunlit uplands that the country is heading towards, even if things are going to be painful for a while. But the budget is what it is. There's rhetoric around it, of course, but people will be able to see what the tax measures and spending measures are and work out for themselves that things probably are going to be quite tough for some people. And so the budget becomes a sort of politically risky moment for the government as well, if the last few weeks of Rachel Reeves saying actually she's more optimistic about the future of the country than she ever has been suddenly is kind of undercut by a series of tough tax and spend decisions.
Newscast from the BBC.
The political obituary is being written this weekend of the former First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, one of the biggest political figures of the last 30 years on the UK stage and, of course, the Scottish stage.
And we spoke to the First Minister, John Swinney, this morning, who is now the SNP leader, who worked alongside him for many, many years, despite the rift between him and the SNP leadership in the last couple of years. And it really struck me that his most memorable, he told us his abiding memory of Alex Salmond would not be the independence referendum in 2014. Wow. It would not be any of the huge things that they did in the government, but it would be the moment when they actually were on their way to power for the first time. And he talked about the moment when he heard Alex Salmond on the radio when they just won the 2007 Scottish election.
I was driving to Edinburgh on the day after the 2007 election, and I listened to him speaking on the radio when he'd arrived in Edinburgh, and he talked about Scotland had changed and changed forever and would never be the same again because of our election win in 2007. And it was a deeply emotional moment for me because I heard my party leader at the time indicating that we'd taken a colossal step forward on our journey to independence. And I fondly remember that moment and what it meant to me in signifying the progress that we had made.
And I remember covering that election, and actually he was right.
Yeah.
It was such a moment. You have to think, for those of us who weren't lucky enough to grow up in Scotland, the SNP was absolutely on the margins. For decades, they were a force on the fringe. It was a group of people and a group of a very activist-y kind of group who cared very deeply and very passionately about that issue, but they were not in the mainstream. And yet in 2007, then to take them into somebody's having their bum on the seat in the First Minister's office, and then go on to win majority, and then go on actually to get the referendum on independence. That is such a dramatic, and actually for lots of people in Scotland, a very unexpected journey. And he was the driving force behind that without question. So it was very interesting to me that was what despite everything that's happened, that was the moment that John Swinney picked out.
I can see why listening to it, because politics is power. If you don't have power, there's no point being in politics. And the system was designed that it did not deliver a majority. I remember when
the Holyrood Parliament
system. And Henry, this is much your territory than mine, whether you were based there or not. The New Labour project to give devolution was a system that was never meant to deliver one party in office. So it was a complete lightning rod. David Cameron had to concede a referendum all that time ago.
Well, that's debatable.
Oh, is it, Henry?
Not only was it a system that would never have been anticipated to secure a majority SNP government at Holyrood, it was a system designed to, in the phrase of, I think Donald Dewar, but perhaps I'm wrong, kill Scottish nationalism stone dead. And so that's the other stunning achievement of Alex Salmond and his generation of SNP politicians, is that nationalism flourished under a process of devolution, which was designed to marginalise it even further than it was in the late 90s when Tony Blair decided to create, after a referendum, the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly as well.
Well, it was meant to be build it and they will go away, instead of build it and they will come. You know, I mean, that's what happened. It was opposite. It was meant to manage and deal with the problem of Scottish voters wanting more of a say after particularly having had a long time under Mrs Thatcher, when there had been either varying between a handful or at some points no Conservative MPs in Scotland, and the devolution settlement was meant to deal with that, as newscasters will no doubt know. But it just all goes in this moment to underline actually the extraordinary achievements of Alex Salmond, and then also reminding us how dramatic then the fall from grace was.
Well, I mean, in terms of this strength, we've described it before as one of the most extraordinary political movements in Europe, what the SNP achieved. And then to go to this psychodrama, as it was called publicly, it's not my name for it, it was called that by people very close to it, between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, followed, Henry, by this high-profile court case. And the obituaries are including all of this, the sort of side of it that we would never have predicted and Alex Salmond never wanted to be known for.
And you can see why some people are sort of saying that some of the tributes to Alex Salmond, warm and magnanimous as they are, perhaps risk sanitizing that element of his political fall from grace. And it undoubtedly was that. That is the principal reason, I think, that he spent the last years of his life estranged from the political party that he took to the brink of independence. One of the great skills I always think of obituary writers and people who make TV obituaries is to present someone's life, warts and all. And clearly that is something that people will be doing about Alex Salmond over the coming days, because you can't not tell the story of why he ended up on Russian state TV and then presenting a TV program in Turkey and, not speaking to his former political protege, Nicola Sturgeon. You can't tell that story without the story of the court case.
So just if newscasters don't remember it, there were multiple claims of sexually inappropriate behaviour by Alex Salmond. None of the charges he was never convicted on any of the charges. His defence lawyer in court, however, did acknowledge that he had behaved badly. And for many people who were caught up in all of that, there was an awful lot of unhappiness on all sides. And also, I think, very sort of tortuous machinations and inquiries and investigations into what role the Scottish Government had played, what role Nicola Sturgeon had played in terms of all of kinds of this. So it was a huge mess with a lot of unhappiness, for sure, which without question really soured relationships between him and the SNP, and particularly this incredible breakdown in what had been an extraordinarily successful political partnership. But there's another point note here as well, is that he ended up again on the fringes while still being this massive big political personality. But his leadership and also his sentiment about where independence had got to sort of embodied the frustration of a lot of people who'd been sort of true believers, that actually after the independence referendum, the SNP should have kept vigorously trying to surge forward to another referendum or another vote. And there's definitely a real vein of frustration in the independence movement that actually the sort of more the SNP leadership, Nicola Sturgeon and then John Swinney and then Humza Yousaf had got a bit too sort of corporate, a bit too sort of comfy in power and didn't really want to charge forward with the cause anymore. Of course, what's also happened is that their political support has fallen away very, very significantly. And independence, while people still care about it in great measure in Scotland, it is nowhere near the sort of prominent issue that it was. And lots of polling would tell you that actually Scottish voters don't want to keep talking about the Constitution. And that's one of the reasons why the SNP have had so many problems.
So we'll move on and look ahead, Henry, perhaps.
Well, it's a big few days for the government, I think. Tomorrow is the investment summit. Obviously, the build-up to it has been a little cloudy for reasons we talked about earlier. But nevertheless, I think the government hopes that this will be a real kind of declaration of intent, both to British voters about how this government intends to operate, but also to British business in advance of what I think will dominate the next few weeks in Westminster, which is the build up to the budget. That's coming at the end of the month, October the 30th. And I think that is going to be, you will start to enter that period where you have more and more rumours and leaks about what the Chancellor is planning to do. A very heavy hint from Rachel Reeves today in the Sunday Times about rewriting the fiscal rules. I think it's pretty clear that's going to happen.
Worst kept secret in
we
Westminster.
predicted it here.
I was going to
Absolutely.
say, who was it who said she'll probably change the rules? I mean, it's clear as day, and a couple of people who've been involved in conversations have it's really clear. The question, of course, is how much are they going to twiddle around with the rules? And the point, newscasters, of them fiddling the rules or twiddling the rules or whatever they do to diddle the rules is that the government would be able to spend more cash, borrow to spend more cash on things that might benefit the economy in the long term, without them getting a ticking off for racking up the national debt.
We say goodbye to you. Thank you very much for listening. Please write to us, improve us, and brickbats and bouquets.
Goodness knows we could all do with a bit of that. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Newscast from the BBC.